questions. Ms. Blaney.
Well, thank you, Chair, and I thank you all so much for being here today. You talked in your report about Manitoba, and I know that in the election in 2019, the Interlake region, within the riding of Churchill, I'm hoping to say it right, Kiwanatinuck Aski in Manitoba had to be evacuated due to the severe snowstorm that hit a lot of communities, and the storm impacted largely Indigenous communities. And as the evacuations took place during early voting, hundreds of voters were not back in their home communities on election day, which meant many First Nations were not able to vote. And really, to me, that means they were disenfranchised. So I'm just wondering, how has Elections Canada moved with this? Has there been any internal investigation done on what went wrong to lead up to this and election day in that particular area?
A couple of things. If you look back at what happened in Manitoba, what was unique in this election compared to others in the past, because there has been floodings in Manitoba, there have been evacuations in the past. Typically, the evacuation was mandatory, which meant that the entire community was brought into typically Winnipeg at a single location. So what we would do in those cases was essentially to transfer the polling place to that location, and we had the entire community. We had the poll workers and the voters. What was extremely challenging in this election is that the evacuation was not mandatory. Some people left, some people stayed. That was true of voters, that was true of poll workers. Those who left did not all go to a single location. They were spread out around the Winnipeg area, but not in a single location. So we could not use the traditional approaches. So what we did, and in some cases, the power was not back on even on polling day. So it was a prolonged period. So we had a central polling, what we call a mega poll in Convocation Hall in Winnipeg for all of the displaced voters, but they had to travel there, and there was transportation organized. And we did open also the polls in the evacuated communities for the people who stayed behind. Now, where there was no power, we had to have reduced hours because it was getting dark and there were security reasons, and we needed to coordinate the process. So I think in these very difficult circumstances, we did quite well. If you look at the turnout, there was a small dip in turnout in the communities. Churchill was the most affected. There was an 11% dip, but the others are talking more about 3%, which is aligned with, in some cases, what you see in the provinces. It depends from one province to province. So I think there was tremendous work that was done on the local level. Returning officers shared their staff. They coordinated their work, and I'm extremely satisfied of the work that was done then. What we need to do looking forward is we had three major weather incidents during the election, and we need to plan for more of that. We had one out east when we tried to open the polls, the RO offices. We had one in Montreal on polling day, and we had Manitoba. So this is a significant challenge on the organization and on the workforce, because when these things happen, you do lose your not just the voters but the workforce as well.
There was also record that Elections Canada officials from Ottawa were making decisions and not really listening to the people who were there locally. And I'm just wondering, how do you figure out that process to make sure, because I think this is really important, looking at rural and remote communities, even if they're in a more urbanized Winnipeg area, there's specific things that local people would know, and it doesn't sound like the communication. So I'm just wondering, what are you doing to look into improving that communication line?
I can assure you that I was on the phone with each returning officer and their teams of the affected communities every day, sometimes twice a day. Every day during the storm period, to understand exactly what was the situation and the extent of the impact on their operations and on their teams. And we had also the returning officers from other neighboring ridings who were not necessarily affected, but who were on the calls to help and share polling locations and share staff. And this happened on a daily basis, all the way between the beginning of the storm during the advanced polls all the way to polling day.
So you said transportation was conducted for voting, and I'm just wondering, you said earlier that it was not as organized because of the nature of this particular issue, and I don't think, I understand it wasn't mandatory, but I'm sure Elections Canada doesn't want to decide for people how to make decisions about their safety and well-being. So I'm just wondering, how did you sort of coordinate to make sure that these people actually had access to the transportation? I would like to hear more on that.
So I'll let my colleague Michelle add to my comments, but just to come back, of course, in the past when the evacuation was mandatory, it was not mandatory by Elections Canada. It was the local authorities that decreed a mandatory evacuation. In this case, there was a provincial state of emergency, but the evacuations were not mandatory. So we had a fluid situation with people basically going everywhere. We had also, through our connections with the Government of Canada security organizations, the RCMP and the GOC network, we had some intelligence on the situation of the power, on the situations on the ground. So we had a network of partners that helped us in understand exactly what was the situation. On the transport, Michelle, if you have information, but we can come back to this with more information.
It was arranged via the Red Cross in Winnipeg, the various locations where evacuees, where we knew that there were evacuees. We made arrangements with the Red Cross to provide for transportations a number of times during election day to take them to convention or to vote.
Thank you, Ms. Blaney. Ms.